The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, Margaret Willey, is the author of 4 books for young adults. She truly captures topics that interest young people and writes with a sensitivity and an awareness of what growing up means today. Her books have all been chosen for inclusion on the American Library Association Best Books for Young Adults list. She'll be talking with Judith Rys, librarian at Holy Spirit School in St. Paul.
I'm pleased to be here today with young adult author Margaret Willey. She was born in Chicago, Illinois, and moved to St. Joseph, Michigan when she was young. St. Joe is about 90 miles north of Chicago. This is really kind of a special interview for me because Margaret and I have known each other for a lot of years. In fact, we go back to the time when my husband and I lived in St. Joseph, Michigan, and Margaret was our babysitter. Today, Margaret lives in Grand Haven, Michigan, with her 9-year-old daughter and her husband. Along with her writing, she also spends time in schools working with children and does some teaching at the local college. Margaret has written 4 young adult novels, the first one being The Bigger Book of Lydia, followed by Finding David Dolores, and then If Not For You, and her most recent novel is called Saving Lenny. I'd like to start out today, Margaret, by asking you a little bit about your growing up years in St. Joe and how that influenced your writing.
Well, people frequently ask me why I'm so interested in writing about teenagers and why the adolescent years are what I'm so concerned with. And I think it does relate very much to the way that I grew up, because I grew up as the oldest daughter in a family of 11. I have 6 brothers and 4 sisters, and because I was the oldest, I was able to kind of watch a whole procession of different teenagers grow up under the same roof with me, and I got to see how different people cope with those years in different ways, some, of course, much more easily than others. And I think this was a tremendous resource for me, and one of the reasons that now I like to recreate all the different ways that people can cope and, you know, make the best of those adolescent years. And I think it's because of the kind of family that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I know from your family background, too, that you come from a real creative family.
Mm-hmm.
Your father is actually a sculptor and a painter and a musician, and your mother is very involved in the visual arts at the local arts center.
Right.
And you have several brothers and sisters who are also artists.
Right.
And I guess I would like to ask you how you happen to choose writing as a creative form of expression instead of the visual arts.
Well, the visual arts are, you know, have always been a part of my background also, but I think that for me, because the visual arts were such a part of the family, writing became something that I did more privately. It was a way for me to find a private place within all the chaos that, you know, that necessarily comes out of a group that large. So writing in a diary, writing in a journal, writing a little poem about something that happened to me at school became a way for me of finding a private space. And I think I continued to do that all through high school and into college, into my college years. Mm-hmm. But I never really thought about writing professionally. Mm-hmm. It was just something that was, you know, was part of my daily life. And it wasn't until after I had tried some other jobs that I decided that I wanted to try and make a profession of writing. And I often write about characters that are involved in visual arts, or that use the visual arts as a resource, as an emotional resource, because I saw so many teenagers do that in my own family. But for me, I think, you know, that writing just evolved as a way of having my own voice in a family like that.
In your family, and because a lot of teachers, librarians watch this program too, and parents, can you give us any suggestions in maybe ways that parents can support children to become creative in writing or in other forms of art? I think that.
Well, I think that every child has a kind of natural form of self-expression within them that they search for, and I do think that parents can encourage children to try different things, to try music, to try drawing, to to be involved in sports. Even, I think, can be a way of really focusing your energy. And I think that parents can help their children to explore, and then once they do find something that they seem to have a special feeling for, to really encourage them. Because I do feel like that is one of the ways that teenagers get through those adolescent years, when their friends let them down and when things aren't going well at school. When they're out of sorts with their family, with their parents. That can be one of the things that really saves them. I know that it was for me in many different situations. As far as what teachers can do, I think the more that a teacher can bring creative individuals from the community into the classroom to talk about different art forms, I think the better, the more that they can do that and show children that there are a lot of different ways to express yourself, and that it's a really worthwhile thing to do and very beneficial.
And I think the children enjoy that. I know the
They
children
do.
visited. Your visit yesterday was very meaningful to the children at our school.
Well, it's meaningful for me too, because it's wonderful for me to actually interact with students and teenagers.
Okay, because that's another question that I had for you too. I thought, now you live with your 9-year-old, but you're writing about the teenage years,
Right.
and I know you draw a lot on your memories, but I'm wondering how you stay in touch, with that age group.
Well, that's a challenge for me, because so much of what I write is about my own memories, which are from being a teenager in a very different time. As I said yesterday, as I told the students, I think a lot of things about being a teenager are still the same. A lot of the struggles to find a voice, to shape an identity that feels right, to make meaningful friendships and to form relationships with the opposite sex. Those kinds of things are still very much a part of a teenager's constellation. But there are some big differences too, and I do think it's important for me to talk to real living, breathing teenagers from time to time, which is why I do try to be in the schools as much as I can, really, because I think it's so important.
So in some ways that's kind of a learning situation for you too,
It
as
is, especially when I can work with a small group and ask them, what do you think about this, and did you think this was realistic, and they'll tell me.
Sure, no, I think that's good. One of the things that I was going to ask you, as long as you mentioned family and parents a little bit, I think in your books it's interesting how your portrayal of your family, of the family, and also the relationship usually between a girl and the mother is real positive. Sometimes I think in young adult books today, we see a lot of kind of like putting down of parents.
I know what you
mean. Just
mean.
talk about that a little bit, because I think.
Well, I think there's definitely some breaking away that goes on, and I mean, I'm already experiencing that with my 9-year-old daughter. But I also feel like teenagers need their parents, and from what I've seen, the families that I've observed, sometimes, in spite of that need to break away, a teenager's mother can really be a great source of strength and inspiration, and I want to try to do justice to both those realities, both the need for a teenager to break away, and also the need for that guidance and that kind of support, even as it fades into the background. I think it's really important, and I don't really like that trend in young adult literature to make fun of parents, to portray them as as buffoons who are completely out of touch. I see that a lot in movies about teenagers too.
Yeah, I think,
and I think it's inaccurate.
No, I really agree with you a lot on that too. Looking back again at your growing up, I'm wondering how much libraries and reading you did as a child. Whether that was a part of your life a lot too.
Yes, it was. It's one of the reasons that I talk about reading, the importance of reading, to students, because I feel like it was just as important in my evolution as a writer.
as the actual writing that I did. I think, you know, you have to read. And I read a lot of books that were like serials, and you know, I didn't only read the classics. I read a lot of books for entertainment. I know they had a really popular thing when I was a teenager were comic books that were the classics. And I must admit, you know, I read the classics too, but I really enjoyed those comic books. So I do feel like it's okay for teenagers to read for entertainment, but if that's all they're doing, it's, you know, it's a pretty unbalanced diet. So you have to try to and which I know that you do, and that you know, so many librarians are committed to prodding them to challenge themselves as well.
Well, and that's reassuring too, I think, to hear that, you know, sometimes we kind of get on this role where we think they should only read good stuff. And it's okay to be reading different kinds of things as long as, like you say, there's a balance to it. Did you have any favorite authors when you were young?
Well, when I was a teenager, they didn't have a young adult
as much.
You know, they didn't. That market didn't exist. I mean, well, it was really just evolving, and so I didn't go to the library and go to the young adult section. And find a lot of wonderful books there. In fact, I think sometimes the books that I write are the books that I wish I could have read as a teenager, because they would have helped me. But I do remember reading, my mother had a lot of suggestions. She remembered books from her own growing up, and she's the one who recommended that I read Catcher in the Rye, for example, and Carson McCullers. Rumour Garden. I remember reading The Green Gage Summer and books like that, you know, I still think teenagers would enjoy those books today. They were very serious books about growing up. And I remember being inspired and comforted by those books. There just weren't as many.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Maybe we want to talk a little bit about the books that you've written. In fact, you kind of a theme running through all of your books, I feel, is that importance of relationships for young people, and I think the significance of friendship and, you know, good friendships and not, and that kind of thing. Let's talk about the first book that you wrote. The Bigger Book of Lydia was the first book that Margaret had published, and she mentioned that it's kind of like has a special spot in her heart because it was the first one. And you want to just tell us a little bit about the book and the people in it?
Okay.
How you got your ideas for the book?
The character of Lydia comes fairly directly out of my own experiences, my own memories as a teenager. I mentioned that I was the oldest daughter in a very large family, so I had a lot of authority and responsibility in my family. I was the big sister, and my brothers and sisters came to me for help and advice, and so I had that position, which sometimes I talk about as being, I mean, there was a need for me eventually to break away from that, but it was also a position of privilege in my family that I enjoyed until it became time for me to break away from it. There was a way in which within my family I was very strong and very needed. In school, on the other hand, I was the smallest in the class for, you know, I mean, from day one, I think, until the time that I graduated. And I had to deal with that, you know, the whole issue of being seen as younger than I was, and with the perception of being unable to do certain things because of that. And I remember that feeling of having kind of a double life. In one arena I was very strong, and in another arena I was perceived as being weak, and it was confusing, and sometimes very painful for me. And I used those memories to create the character of Lydia, who is a teenager who, because of some situations, her father dies in the novel, which, you know, my father's still living. There are definitely some differences.
Sure.
She doesn't have brothers. You know, I had 6. So there are some big differences. But I do remember that dichotomy between, you know, my home personality and my school personality. And I gave that dichotomy to Lydia, and in doing that, you know, I made it essential for her to, you know, to solve that and to come to terms with that. And one of the ways she does it is through a friendship with a teenager who is also obsessed with her size for a different reason. Teenager named Michelle, who has anorexia, who through a set of circumstances comes into Lydia's home and lives with her and her family. And they form a very special bond that ends up strengthening both of them. And that's really where that character originated for me.
I think one of the interesting things too about this book is that I had a number of students read it, and it was kind of like their first experience of hearing about somebody with anorexia, and they found that really very interesting.
Yes.
And I think because it's a serious problem with young women today in our society, I
Right.
think it kind of exposed them to that
Right.
kind of thing. So, Margaret's second book, Finding David Dolores, is written for the younger, I guess what we call the teenage group. We talked about how a young adult writer writes for anything from 12 to 18 plus years old, and this was the second one that she wrote about a 13-year-old girl. And I think the story behind it is rather interesting too, because she said she draws the character in this one from her own background also.
Well, the character in this book is 13, and she's at that point in her life where her family is not, she's starting to feel very critical of her parents, and no longer interested in interacting with her mother. They've been very close, and she's bored, and it's summer, and she's looking for some kind of an adventure. And she begins to follow an older boy, a much older boy, who she becomes fascinated with, and kind of spies on him and keeps notes about him and fills her life this way. And I remember doing this as a young teenager with a friend. In reality, my friend was sort of, she was the instigator. She was the person who was much more obsessed with following this older boy. In the novel, I give Arlie, the narrator, that kind of a level of obsession. And in reality, we never really met the boy, never really confronted our fantasy. But in the novel, the teenagers do confront their fantasy and have to come to terms with a real and complicated person, and some complicated relationships that result from that, from confronting that fantasy. But I do, I remember that boredom. I remember wandering through the town of St. Joseph, Michigan, where I grew up, and I used those memories to kind of create this odyssey that Arlie is on through the course of the novel.
And it's kind of fun when you say you're remembering back in St. Joseph how you do use, and because I've lived there, you do use the town of St. Joseph a lot.
Right.
In the ravines, talking about
Right.
them sneaking through, making a
Right.
path through the ravine, and the statue in the park, and all of that kind of thing.
Well, in this book, I think I really do focus on the relationship between teenagers and solitude, which a lot of teenagers are afraid of. They're afraid to be alone. They're afraid of being perceived as being alone. And there are some things that can only happen to you, even as a child and as a teenager, when you're alone. Some really important things, some important self-discoveries that can only happen to you when you sort of, you face that solitude. And Arlie does that, and it's part of her growing up. And I remember that too. I had some years where I felt alone, and where I really, I think I reveled in that solitude, in some ways, and that was very good for me.
Sure.
And I think, can be good for other teenagers too.
In the books that you've done so far, what you have mentioned is that you've changed the name of St. Joseph to St. Martin's, and
Right.
you've kind of changed the names around. And I know you talked about how some students that you visited felt bad about that, and they want you to use...
Well, in January of this year, I went back to St. Joseph and did some presentations in the schools there, which was a wonderful experience for any author, to go back to the school that where you grew and suffered and struggled, and and go back there as as somebody who's really been able to do something with those memories. And so it was really a wonderful experience. But the students asked me to please stop calling St. Joseph St. Martin's, and to please call it St. Joseph, because they wanted there to be books that were written about their town. And so of course I was just really thrilled then to do that. And the book that I'm writing now is set very much in St. Joseph.
And I think that's neat, because I think that, maybe all authors wouldn't be so willing to do that, but I think that's wonderful that you're going to listen to those young people and say, okay.
Well, the
I'll
reason
do
that I didn't do it originally was because I was concerned that readers would assume that these novels were autobiographical if I had a lot of details that were so literally from my own past. But as it turns out, a lot of readers assume they're autobiographical anyway, so I just don't worry about that anymore.
Okay,
And
sure.
so I'm ready to.
Comfortable with it, yeah. Margaret's third book, If Not For You, is set again, of course, in the small town, and it's about a young couple who, in their high school year, senior year, after the homecoming dance, decide to run off and go do their own thing together, and they come back eventually to town as a married couple and have a child, and then it goes on about their relationship. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about where you got the idea from that book. And
Right. Well, it's appropriate to talk about with you, Judy, because the main character in If Not For You, Bonnie, is a babysitter, and and I do feel like babysitting is one of the ways that a teenager can get out of her family and see a certain kind of world. It's a very domestic kind of sphere. It's very interior, but it's a way for them to see families and worlds and households that are different from her own, and to see them on her own terms in a kind of privacy that you don't have when you just do that with your friends. And I remember that was important to me, that I would be kind of fascinated with these other households and the dynamics and the children, and so I drew on some of those memories of being a babysitter and babysitting at times for couples that were only a few years older than I was, but that were already married and and had babies. So there was that fascination with how much a person's world can change in just a few years, especially as a teenager who was still very much a daughter, very much still in the world of childhood, and to be able to see at very close range this much more adult world with other teenagers, with other teenagers that were that had created that. So that is something that I used as the basis for Arlie's fascination with the household of this couple who ran away and then came back.
Okay. Another thing that I noticed a lot, Margaret, in your books, and I think this one in particular, in some ways there's kind of, I think, a sense of young women needing to kind of look at their role. In this case, the girl had this child now, and Jeremy was really kind of a big part of her life, but but her relationship with Ray was not working out, and that marriage wasn't working out, and I think that to me there's just a real kind of a strong, healthy message in this story for young adults to kind of look at the realities of their actions and then the consequences that they might have from them. And I was thinking in this book now, when you start to write the story, do you kind of have a message in mind for young people, or does that just kind of come out of the story?
Well, I think that it comes out of the story. I like to think that it comes out of the story, that it's an organic kind of process, because I really don't set out with a message. I think that teenagers have radar for books that do that, and that they resist, that they will resist that if they feel like they're being preached at. I think a lot of teenagers will resist that, and I think what I try to do is just to create a scenario where teenagers are dealing with the consequences of some really rash behavior and suffering as a result. And Arlie observes that, but she doesn't think that they're bad people. She doesn't think that what they did was bad, and so that there isn't that judgment going on. It's really something, I like to think that it's something much more, she's just learning something about human nature and about the way that people make mistakes, but she is learning that, that there are consequences for mistakes and for behaving in a way that's irresponsible, and that, so I do think that it's a challenge for a young adult author not to preach, because there is kind of that maternal instinct that I feel even more strongly now that I have a daughter who's on the brink of adolescence, to say, now don't do this, and be careful not to do that, and, but you really can't do that. I think you have to do something that is much more, that that embraces the human condition a little bit more than that.
I think you do that very, very effectively. I think particularly in this story. Your last book, Saving Lenny, was published just in 1990, and is written really for, I think, the more mature end of the young adult category. And I think here again in this story, it's about a couple who make a choice too after high school, rather than go off to college, to go kind of against their parents' will and decide to go off and live together. And then I think in this book too, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the characters develop, because I think there's a real, you've done very well describing a relationship again that wasn't healthy.
Right.
Where a couple fell in love, in quote, but was it really love?
Right.
And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the characters in this story.
Well, I think that the way that the relationship begins in high school is very typical. I mean, the teenagers involved are still very much supported and protected by their families, but they decide that because they're at a point where they want to break away, they begin to scheme in a way that teenagers often do for ways that they could break away and be together. But in the course of this, we as the reader begin to discern, and this is done through alternating narration, begin to pick up on the fact that there's something wrong with this boy in the novel, that he's unhappy in ways that are much more complicated than some of the more routine frustrations of what teenagers go through when they're at the point where they decide, that it's time to break away. Something much more. He's much more disturbed. Right. And but the girl who's in love with him is blinded by her love, and feels the way I think many teenage girls feel, that if she just loves him enough, that she'll be able to help him in any way that that he may need. So they make these arrangements to cut themselves off from all the people that could help them. They go to a secluded cottage and live there together, and then the boy has a much more severe kind of breakdown while they're in that secluded situation. And then throughout the rest of the novel, the girl has to decide what she's going to do about that, and how much she can do and what she can't do.
Right. And I think that that book again has a very good message as to something for young people to think about when they go into relationships. Well, I guess as things always happen, time runs out much too quickly. It's been absolutely delightful to have you here, and I've enjoyed this visit so much. I know that this is your second trip to the Twin Cities. I certainly hope you enjoy the rest of your visit.
I think I will, and I'll be back. Thank you, Judy.
That's great. It's been great. Thanks.
Margaret Willey's books are available at your local library. Do check them out. Thank you, Margaret Willey, Judith Rys, and thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.